Does God take sexual sin personally? Let's dive right in. You and I had a conversation earlier today, James, and we were talking about Romans chapter 1 that begins the section we were discussing in verse 18, saying the wrath of God is revealed against heaven, from heaven, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. And you pointed out that the word wrath is very personal. Yeah. And in this chapter, he's discussing the things that bring out God's wrath.
Well, we tend to associate wrath in a very negative sense from a human perspective, because most of the time when we've seen people show wrath, it's over things they don't deserve. They're overblown, they're overreactive. A husband gets angry and goes to his wife's favorite thing in the house and breaks it just to make her angry.
That's not a smart man.
Over what? And given enough time, he probably can't even remember in a couple of weeks. But obviously, that's a bit abusive on certain aspects. But the thing is that we don't know how to apply wrath because we get offended over things that aren't really offenses. But God has laid out the very things that are very personal to him. Why? Because this is his creation. Everything that we see belongs to him. We belong to him. We were made by him. So if he says, live this way, this is how I made you, this is why I made you, and then we rebel against it, then what is God to do with the thing that he made and the people that he made when they're going against the very reason why he made them? Mm-hmm. Doesn't he have a right to get angry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doesn't he have the right to be upset? And of course, in Romans here, to the point of wrath, I think it's completely justifiable.
You made me think of the image of me as a kid living in my parents' home. And even though it was my home, there was, maybe I should say it this way, it may have been my home, but it was their house. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I knew that there were certain things I wasn't supposed to touch. There were certain things I could do that would bring about real consequences.
Yeah.
And so I had to keep my place. And I knew that I was living in that house. But again, even though I felt a strong sense of belonging, I'm not saying I felt like an outcast, but I knew for sure I was the child and they were the parent. And maybe what Romans 1 is suggesting is God's the parent.
That's
and his wrath comes when we violate the house rules.
That's right. And he has complete right over those rules. And I think that's one of the things that really Romans is dealing with is a disobedient, rebellious spirit that basically looks at God and his ways and says, no, I'm going to do it my way. And God says, fine, but I don't have to keep you around.
Yeah, I like the 19th verse because it says, because that which is known about God is evident within them because God made it evident to them. Right. Since the creation of the whole world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made so that they are without excuse. And they knew God, he says in that next verse. So when I read that, I think that this really flies in the face of people who somehow claim that, first of all, there's no evidence of God, or secondly, that since they don't know about God, that in ignorance, even if there is a God, he'll save them because they didn't know. These verses say, no, there is enough evidence in this world, and that if it was true then, it's true now, because he said since the creation of the world, he's gone through every culture that has ever lived. He has said there is enough evidence to point them to seek me, to tell them to search for me.
Well, and if you look at Scripture at face value, the way God intended it, he tells you there was a time period where all men came from Noah and all the men before Noah from Adam. So we all have a similar starting point. So all the people who went out from Adam and those who went out from Noah after the flood, they knew of the one God. Now, maybe they were angry. Some people have interpreted Babel. The reason why they were building a tower is so that if God flooded the earth again, they would be high enough so he couldn't get them.
Right, exactly.
And it's like, well, maybe that was one of the reasons. But the Bible makes a very clear picture that we are not innocent of not knowing. He's always made sure that from the very beginning we knew who he was. Now, if we turned away from him and pursued other gods, that's on us. Now, academia will tell you that Moses stole from Egypt and Samaria. But the Bible tells you, no, he was part of a remnant that preserved the relationship to the one Creator.
Yeah, that's right. So Acts 17 says there were times of ignorance that God winked at, but now he demands all men everywhere repent. And that tells me that we have an obligation right now we will stand before God in a judgment of our choices and our actions. And when we leave God out, when we move away from the evidence and we reject the evidence and we seek our own path, trouble starts. And that's what Romans 1 is talking about. I think that it actually, even though Romans 1 is frequently used, and in fact, we're using it today even to discuss how sexual sin is an affront to God, why it's so offensive that it brings his wrath. But it's not the only thing that brings his wrath. But I do think that in Romans 1, sexual sin is presented as, in large part, as representative of man when he finally reaches the point where he rejects all of God's rule. So that he finally says, I don't care how you think you made me or what rules you said I was to follow. I will do what I want to do. I was teasing, this was truly just a joke, teasing my wife this morning a little bit.
Okay.
She asked me to do something, and I said, you do realize that when you ask me to do something, even if it's something I really want to do, that makes me not want to do it sometimes. Now, is that bad? And actually, I was talking about our cat more than anything. Okay. She opened the door to let the cat in, and the cat was all, nah. Cat really wanted in the house. But the fact that we wanted the cat to come in the house, the cat goes, nah, I'm not doing it. That's kind of the attitude some people have toward God, which is, even if something is maybe something I desire, I don't want to do it if God wants me to do it. There is an innate rebellion in some people, and it's seen here because he's saying, look, you got all this evidence, but because you think you're so smart and you don't honor God, that's what verse 21 says and 22, you become futile in your speculations. You start imagining things. Your heart is foolish and it's darkened, and you turn so far away from God that even though you know him, you won't even give thanks to him as God. You won't acknowledge him as God, and professing to be wise, you become fools. That's a painful verse to read.
Well, talking about the spirit of rebellion or disobedient, I think at the end of Romans, it says disobedient to parents.
Yes, it does.
But if you look at the main relationships we have the hardest time receiving information from, it starts with our parents. And then when you get married, it then becomes the person that you join with over time.
Right.
Once you get past the first couple of years,
yes.
Past the honeymoon stage, stuff starts coming out. And eventually there are marriages where because she says it, I don't want to do it. Or because he says it, she's definitely not going to do it. And it's like, well, what is that? What is that? Yeah. And yet you see it with our culture today towards God, which is actually where it really starts. Not with the parents. That's what it seems to be. But behind that is actually the way that we're treating our parents or our spouse or us other people that maybe we hate is actually a reflection of our relationship with God. And Romans 1 goes straight to the main thing, which is our relationship with God. And there is a group of people who've gotten to a point who says, just because God says it, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, that's right. And it starts with parents because, again, every earthly relationship, I believe, is given to us to teach us about a spiritual counterpart. So our relationship as parent and child is really reflective of our relationship with God, father and child. And when you see those two side by side, you realize that a rebellious child is going to be rebellious to God. Maybe that's the reason that way back in Deuteronomy, it even had as the penalty for rebellion as a child is death.
And that's something I think about a lot. My father, his dad, my grandfather, I never got to meet him because he died in a hotel when my father was 10 years old, alcoholism, heart issue. And my father was fearful when he married my mother because he says, I don't know if I can be a dad because I didn't have a father that I can look to as an example. And then he realized that because he didn't have a father he could look to as an example, he then realized that his relationship with God the Father was dysfunctional. And so my dad early on, what helped him the most was that realization of how those relationships are connected. And my mother had an incredible relationship with her father, which helped her relationship with God because there was so much love between her and her father biologically that it was easy for her to just apply it to the spiritual relationship with her true father from heaven. And so these relationships are very important. And when they're severed or there's dysfunction, and what's so sad about the situation with God, not that God should be pitied, but the thing is that God is a perfect father. and his laws and his decrees are perfect. And what's so crazy about it, they're designed for us to have the best and most peaceful existence in life here on earth. And then we say, no.
Yeah,
it's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's Jesus on the hill overlooking Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather you together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you won't let me. Yeah. That's the epitome of mankind, isn't it? Yeah. So when we read Romans 1, we see that. And this is what he's saying is, look, I've given you the best of everything. I've put all the evidence here that you should seek and find me. I am here. I'm not hidden under a rock. He's a good father. I'm a good father. I provide for you. I provide blessings for you. I carry you to my side. I've shown you, verse 23, the glory of the incorruptible God. And yet what you've done is you've rejected and you've turned away from that and exchanged, verse 25 says, the truth of God for a lie. There's an interesting phrase that first appears in verse 24. It appears 3 times in the chapter. In verse 24, he says, because they have done this, they have turned away from me. Why are they deserving of my wrath? Well, because their evil, the wickedness that's in them, their wicked desires have reached a full growth. And so he says in verse 24, because of this, God gave them over. Verse 24 says he gave them over to impurity. Verse 26 says he gave them over to degrading passions. Verse 28 says he gave them over to a depraved mind. And when you look at those things, really what he's saying in verse 24 is your impurity carried you to false worship. I gave you over to that. Your degrading passions carried you to unnatural sexual desires, and I gave you over and let you flesh that out completely. And then in verse 28, I gave you over to a depraved mind. That word means counterfeit in the Greek. So your mind's not functioning properly, and now all of a sudden you can't judge right and wrong and good and evil. You get so confused. Up seems like down, and back seems like front, and you can't even tell up from down. It's like a pilot that gets lost and can't fly by instruments, and he's upside down and doesn't even realize it. And he's saying because of that, you've been carried away into unrighteousness. So in all that language, what I see is that the wrath of God comes ultimately when he, because of their rejection of him, allows their evil to fully flesh itself out to the degree that the only thing that can be done with it is destruction. Yeah.
Well, it's so mind-blowing to me. Is, we will for degree. God is gracious. God is not just a God of second chances, but again, chance after chance. God is long-suffering. His hesed, his loving kindness. He is patient. He endures. He's willing to wait. But Romans 1 is saying, if you cross a line, he'll say, enough is enough. He actually has a limit.
He does. I think of 1 Corinthians 5. Do you remember that's the passage where Paul jumps all over the church at Corinth because they were allowing a man to live with his father's wife in open defiance of all the rules of marriage. And he says to them, and I'm going to really paraphrase, but what in the world is wrong with you? You have not mourned, and instead you just accepted this. And I can't praise you in this. And he goes so far as to say, I've decided to deliver this man over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh so that his soul might be saved in the last day. There's an example of Paul as a representative of God, as an apostle, saying, look, there are lines that bring the wrath of God, and they begin to infect all of us. In that chapter, he even says, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. In other words, you put just a little bit of sin in and the whole thing is soon ruined. And so he's saying, keep the church pure. And again, in that same chapter, he says, I'm not talking about the people in the world. I'm talking about people in the body of Christ, in the church. That's where we have to pay special attention. And that's a very rough passage, but it worked, James. In the second letter that he writes to Corinth, he speaks about this man. You can hear it. He doesn't call it by name, but he says, you remember in essence that guy that I told you to put out? Well, now don't make him overly sorrowful. He's clearly come back. Throw your arms around him and love him. And so it was the withholding of the blessing that created the environment for that man to be restored. And I think that Romans 1 is a good example of that. God, when he says, I gave them over, I don't think it's because he hates them. I know that. It's not because he wishes ill, but it's like, if I withhold the blessing, maybe you'll finally see that it wasn't such a bad thing to have me as your father. And so it's a way to bring them back.
And the sad thing is once a society gets to a certain point, sometimes They won't.
They won't.
And that's the thing, is like, it goes back to what we said. He's very patient. He's very kind. He's very forgiving. But if you push that line too far, there is the side that is the wrath of God. Mm-hmm. That because of Christ, we no longer have to fear the wrath of God, because he took that burden upon him on the cross. But those who do not come into reconciliation through Christ, they're having to deal with the side of God that I pray I never have to see.
Boys, and that's the truth. The very last verse in Romans 1 says, even though they knew the ordinance of God, and they knew that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do them, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. When I read that, what I immediately go to in my mind is the story of Jesus with the woman at the well. People like to quote that one and talk about how Jesus approached a woman, a Samaritan, on, let's call it foreign soil. You know what I mean by that. He was kind of out of the comfort zone of Judaism. And it says that he's the first one that he introduces to her as the first person the fact that he's the Messiah in really, really clear words. And you'll remember that Jesus, he doesn't just let her sin sit there undealt with. He faces it head on. And I think that this is what we have to learn to do to avoid the wrath of God. We have to face it head on. And even from pulpits, and even in dealing with our friends who are in the world that maybe are lost, we still have to deal with the sin. If you look at this encounter, he interacts with this woman in spite of her sexual sin.
That's right.
And then, but he doesn't just avoid it. He actually targets it.
Yeah.
He says, go get your husband and I'll tell you this. Well, I don't have a husband. Yeah, that's right. You've had 7 other men, and the one you're living with now isn't your husband.
Yeah.
So he clearly pulls it to the forefront and deals with it, because again, any sin, sexual sin or otherwise, can get between us and God. And if we don't deal with it, it brings that wrath we've been talking about.
Yeah, and the thing is, what God desires for all people is he wants us to get rid of that thing between them, so that we can have this amazing relationship with him, and we can receive the blessings and the intention and the peace. Because sometimes life is very hard, but when you have the relationship with God, as Philippians says, there's a peace that surpasses all understanding. You don't want to go through life without a relationship with God. You don't want to experience that. I don't know how people get through this world without Christ, because so many times when I'm going through a hard time, I have that hope that gets me back to center. There's so much that you lose for the sake of sin that it's just not worth it.
Yeah, that's right. And it all comes about because we exchange the natural for the unnatural. I've read those words in verse 26 many times. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And the same way men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire towards one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. I have said for a long time that I feel like when we finally allow ourselves to slip into these depths of sexual sin, we've reached rock bottom.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's because, to me, it appears that way. And it's not that this sin is any worse than any other. Don't get me wrong. But it shows that we have reached the point where, again, there is no respect for God's authority anywhere.
Yeah.
And in our culture, I think we've gone even further. I don't know. I'm no expert, have not studied transgenderism and cross-dressing and all of those things. But it seems to me that it has been around for a while, but it's never been approved. Even in the Roman culture, being effeminate was considered a bad thing. Even though homosexuality was practiced in the Roman Empire, to be effeminate as a man was still not acceptable. The passive one in the sexual relationship is that, you and I were talking about this earlier.
Yeah, it was strange. It was acceptable, but the feminine men was not acceptable.
Right.
And so it's strange, but it's called, like, for example, you talk about homosexuality and other sins. What makes homosexuality different than, let's say, regular sexual sin is that it says, it's okay, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to mess up there's a difference between a man doing sexual morality with the opposite sex, because at least
still
there's
within an order.
at least there's a component that God intended there.
Right.
But when you have two sexes coming together sexually, not only is that sexual morality, but it's a perversion of the original design. And you can almost you can do that with all the other sins too. Like, for example, the Vikings, they took murder and made it honor. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
As a good thing.
Right.
And God's like, no. You know, even people who commit murder recognize it's wrong, but you're like, yeah, how many people have you killed today, son? Awesome.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
To a Viking, it was like a check mark of how many people you take down in battle, and you made them pay. Once it gets to that level of grotesque twisting, then you have to answer to God for that.
So it takes the natural and turns it into exchange it for something that's unnatural.
That's right.
And that language comes in over and over again here. And I when I read that, what I realize is that it's like verse 27 says, when we do these things, and I'm going to quote the last part of the verse, we receive in our own persons the penalty of our own error. And that tells me that the consequences of those sins are played out even in our own flesh. Yeah. Now we can get into a big, long discussion here. Does that mean that, like, sexually transmitted diseases or AIDS or other things are somehow punishments, like a curse because of sexual sin? I don't know that they're a curse or necessarily associated even with the eternal punishment. I have a feeling you'd much rather have AIDS than deal with hell. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, how can two virgins give each other an STD?
Oh, wow. So what you're saying is if we do it the natural, intended way, we avoid all that nonsense?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, even I was watching, I think, an interview with Jordan Peterson, and he was talking about sexual partners, and he says the men who have a lot of sexual partners, they tend to be the same group. So there's a lot more exchange to the same people with sexual morality.
Right.
So what goes around comes around is much more prevalent with that type of, lifestyle of being promiscuous. You're more likely to get something if someone else has it. But two people who stayed pure to marriage, I mean,
pretty much do whatever you want.
What are the odds?
Yeah, that's right. Pretty much do whatever you want, however you want, however often you want. It doesn't make any difference. It's fine. It's blessed, you might say. And I wouldn't say that. It is blessed.
Yeah.
Because we're operating within the natural relationship and the natural order that God has intended. Yeah. But when we get outside of that, again, we receive in our flesh the penalty. And that will be, I can hear so many things in that. I hear Jesus, or Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 5, that I've decided to give such one over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. And I hear other passages. It floods my mind with images that when we slip into sexual sin, we have put ourselves on a downward spiral that ultimately just consumes us.
That's right.
And so
it's a progression.
It is a progression. And so when you look at the end of Romans 1, this is interesting. This is rarely quoted, but this list that starts in verse 28 when he says, you've reached this point now where you've been given over to this depraved mind, and that word depraved can be translated no judgment. You have now a flawed judgment. You can't discern between right and wrong and good and evil.
Yeah, you don't feel bad about it.
You don't feel bad about it. Yeah. Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, right? But then he says, look at all of this unrighteousness that they are now doing, things that are not proper. I'm using the language of Scripture here. Unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, malice, envy, murder, strife, deceit, gossip, slander, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. That's a long list of things that go in the same bucket as this unnatural attraction of homosexual sin. And it's all in the same bucket. Now, here's the deal.
Yeah.
I have my own struggles, the things that I battle with. I have my own temptations, and you do too. But I don't expect you to cut me any slack. I expect you to challenge me in the things that drive the wedge between God and me. Yeah. Because I don't want anything to be there that keeps me from being saved. And I understand people who say, well, I just feel this attraction. I can't help it. I feel this strong attraction to the opposite, to the same sex rather than the opposite sex. And how can that be wrong? How can it be that it's a bad thing because I feel attracted to a man if I'm a man? You need to, and they play a guilt card, James. And I'll tell you what, I'm kind of tired of the guilt card. Look, they may feel a strong pull to that sexual sin.
Yeah.
It's no different than the pull that I feel toward the sins, the temptations that are in my life.
Yeah.
If they want me to feel sorry for them, then they need to feel sorry for me. The point is, we're all fighting what is in us that's drawing us away from God. Am I wrong in
No, I mean, if
that?
you take, right now our culture is really trying to neutralize and make every sexual act acceptable. And like you said, the seared conscience, get rid of judgment and everything. But if you look at God's law and you apply the thinking to anything else, and we have a conversation, I say, Mike, man, I just always have the desire to just kill that person. That guy needs to go.
Well, James, go ahead and do it if you feel it.
Or whatever at someone's house, I'm always checking out what they have, because when they're gone, I'm going to
James,
take it.
You probably love it more than me, so go ahead and just take it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is covetousness. I mean, which is stealing.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you take it with any other sin and you take the same logic and apply it to that, you're like, whoa, I don't want to be around that person.
Yeah.
But because our culture is trying to neutralize sexuality to where it's not a big deal, it's just, whatever. We think that that's really different because our culture has said so.
And it's funny because what we're seeing is a world that's trying to make us be ashamed of what God has said, rather than to be ashamed of what we know in our hearts is wrong.
Back, I think it was a couple weeks ago, we were looking at Sodom and Gomorrah, and you remember the angels are coming into Lot's house, and it's not just like a couple guys, it's like it says a crowd of men are like, we want to have sex with those guys, those men. And you're thinking, back to the seared conscience, when you stop caring about other people and only what you want, that's like an army of sociopaths outside of Lot's house who doesn't care about what happens to those guys. They want their way with them. When you start giving into, well, I want that, you're actually creating a culture of narcissism and a sociopath mindset. And I assure you, if you cater to that, after a while, you're not going to want to live there very long.
So what do you think ultimately Romans 1 is trying to encourage these Christian people to do? I mean, what is he calling them to observe and then to actually do?
Yeah, well, he's letting them know very clearly what God's line is. Don't cross this line. Do not act in this way. He's not just targeting these people for the sake of, well, they're going to experience God wrath. Ha, ha, ha. No, he's saying, know your limits. Know God's limits. Do not condone and approve of practices. Well, that's a big statement. The last verse that you read, where it says, not only do they do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. That means that's a hard charge on the church. In fact, if you're a follower of Christ and you're listening to this letter being read in the first century, that may cause you to look inwardly. Gee, am I doing anything right now in the culture that's actually giving approval to this behavior?
Right.
And what should I do about that?
And James, that behavior that you're referring to is not just the unnatural acts of homosexuality. And he specifically deals with both lesbianism and male-to-male contact. It's not just that. It's that whole list.
Yeah, gossiping.
Right, all of them. And if you disobedient to parents, we may need a series on this, a podcast to talk about that one phrase, because I think that he puts it in the same category. And again, I would point out to you that it's one of the few sins that authorize the death penalty in the Old Testament is disobedience, to be rebellious to your parents, without thought, without you can't change them. They just literally have reached a point where they're just beyond control, beyond help. And you have to ask, well, why such severe penalties on that? Because of how it affected the culture ultimately in the end. Raise a whole generation of children who have no rules, and see what your culture ends up being. Look out, America.
Yeah.
Look out, America.
And that's no joke. I mean, you're right. It's just when you start losing trust in parents, when you start losing trust in government, when you no longer trust God, which is tied to faith, by the way. Faith and trust go hand in hand. You're going to end yourself up in a culture and a country that you're really not going to want. You're not going to like very much. That's right. So again, he's probably trying to say two things. You're telling me that, number one, look at the ways that we reflect a unnatural relationship with God. Look at the things that put a wedge between you and God, and get rid of those, because we do not seek
want, desire, or to even, we don't see his wrath.
And another thought too, if you keep reading Romans, before Jesus was our model and our example to the Jew is Abraham. Mm-hmm. So he starts off heavy in Romans, but then the next couple of chapters, who does he go to point an example of? Abraham. Mm-hmm. How did Abraham live with God? Why was that so different? Why did God make a promise through him? Right. What God expects from us is actually found in Abraham and then ultimately shown and fulfilled perfectly through Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And of course, one of the things that always brings me comfort is Abraham was not a morally perfect man, was he, by any stretch?
But strong in faith.
Very strong in faith. The very next chapter, and we're going to end with this, it says in chapter 2 of Romans, it says, we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. Don't think that you will escape if you practice these same things. So the wrath of God is a very real thing. Yeah. And we can see very clearly from this chapter the indicators that we have moved away from the rule and reign of God.
That's right.
And we know that the right thing to do is for us to find the grace and mercy that is in Christ Jesus, and then to live godly lives in I'm going to say in an effort to try to express our gratitude to God for what he's done for us. So we are now free from these terrible sins into this wonderful grace of Christ.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope that you'll spend some time thinking about what stands between you and God, and maybe spend some time this week asking the question, am I living in any way that warrants the wrath of God? If so, let's get it fixed. We'll see you next time.